Well, welcome. Welcome. So the topic of the 2013 BJIL Symposium is how do we measure governance and rule of law? Or more precisely, how can we tell if governments are doing a good job at providing the basic social, political, economic, and legal infrastructure that will promote welfare and human development? In short, how are they doing in enabling citizens to pursue the good life and visions of the good life? So indicators or particular kinds of measurements that we heard about in the keynote, with the keynote speaker just a few moments ago, are one tool used to provide us with information to evaluate how well or poorly a particular government is doing in this endeavor, and to identify trends and patterns over time. So this, our first panel, will explore what these indicators measure and how well, and what are their shortcomings and dangers, and how these indicators have changed over time and evolved. So I'm delighted to introduce the panelists. My introductions will be apologetically brief in the interests of giving more time for the speakers and their remarks, and then the discussion amongst us. The biographies of the speakers are included in the conference materials, so for those of you who want more information, it is available with a click of a button or a turn of the page. First, I will introduce Tim Butte, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Duke University. He's a co-principal investigator of the International Standards Project. This research involves multi-country, multi-industry business surveys about the global private politics of setting standards for international product and financial markets. This research is presented in a book published by Princeton University Press called New Global Rulers, The Privatization of Regulation in the World Economy. He has a PhD from Columbia University and a BA from Harvard College. Next, Kevin Davis is Vice Dean and the Beller Family Professor of Business Law at New York University. His current research is focused on contract law, the governance of financial transactions involving developing countries, and the general relationship between law and economic development. He's also been a distinguished visitor at several law schools, including the University of Southern California, Cambridge University, and the University of the West Indies and Barbados. Professor Davis received his BA from McGill University, an LLM from the University of Toronto, an LLB from the University of Toronto, and an LLM from Columbia University. And last but certainly not least, immediately to my left, is Katerina Linos. She is an assistant professor of law here at Bolt Hall. Her work combines legal analysis with empirical methods, examining why law reform and policy innovation spread around the world in waves. She has a new book published by Oxford University Press, The Democratic Foundations of Policy Diffusion, that argues that politicians choose to follow certain international models to win domestic elections. Prior to joining Bolt, Professor Linos was an international law fellow and lecturer at Harvard Law School. She completed her JD and her PhD in political science, both degrees at Harvard. So the format for the panel will be that each panelist will speak for approximately 10 to 12 minutes. I will keep the time. And then we're going to open it up to a round of questions, then discussion and response to the panelists, and then back to the audience for questions. So we hope to weave in that a discussion amongst everyone in the room, giving an opportunity to our distinguished guests and experts to provide their commentary to each other, and well as in response to questions. So without further ado, I will begin with Tim.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. As Professor Fletcher said in her introduction, I have worked fairly extensively on the setting of standards for products, for food safety, for financial reporting, and other things, looking at it as a political process, both in the official public governmental institutions, as well as in private organizations. Why that's relevant, you'll see in a minute. But that previous work leads me to look at indicators essentially as a kind of measurement standard. Since I'm the first one to speak, I thought I should say a few words about what my understanding of indicators actually is, what they are, and what they entail. And I think there are two things that are worthwhile here distinguishing. The first step, in a way, is that creating an indicator entails identifying and thereby circumscribing a phenomenon, such as rule of law, or maybe much more problematically, justice, as distinct and separable from the social context, from the broader social context in which they are clearly deeply embedded. This can be done in crude ways. It can also be done in quite sophisticated ways, often taking into account functional equivalence in different contexts, so it doesn't have to be context-independent in a crude way, but the result of it is to create a measure of this phenomenon that's no longer dependent upon a particular context. At that stage, you're still dealing usually with a fairly complex phenomenon, and so the second step in creating an indicator is to simplify a multidimensional phenomenon in some presumably systematic ways, so as to allow in the end a numerical representation of it, at least on an ordinal scale, on a single dimension. This creates then scores that can be compared with each other and used in rankings, ratings, or as variables in statistical analyses, etc. This kind of simplification that's an inherent part of creating an indicator is appealing for a number of reasons. I think it sort of intuitively appeals to our desire for simplicity and clarity. It also is absolutely necessary for many of the reasons that we heard about in the keynote address. If you want to actually get a sense of what policy interventions might possibly have desirable or undesirable effects, you need to have some way of measuring the status quo and measuring whether there's a change in it. But this simplification is essentially achieved by turning the problem of understanding a complex phenomenon into a measurement problem. Now, measurement is quite fundamental and important. If you think about sort of common translatable measures for weights, length, volumes, etc., you can easily see that markets, for instance, cannot exist and will function without them. And in fact, if you look historically about the difference between functioning and essentially non-functioning attempts to create markets, often they turn on such simple things as being able to measure the goods that, and maybe even the other things that are big areas of value that people were supposed to exchange. Now that illustration, I think, suggests that these kinds of measurement standards could be thought of as having what economists call public goods characteristics. And thinking about it in economistic terms, I think easily leads one to think of it as essentially a supply and demand problem, where often, in fact, we would expect supply to be short, if public goods usually are undersupplied. That's a little bit striking given the proliferation of indicators that we've seen, which sometimes leads one to maybe rather think that in fact they're oversupplied. And so that maybe raises one question about the simple use of a supply and demand kind of framework. But from my point of view, there's something much more problematic in a way about it. In that a supply and demand framework, at least the traditional simple kind, assumes a complete separation of those who supply and those who demand. That's why the intersection of their curves gives us a sense of a fair market outcome. So one of the ways in which I've thought about indicators involves creating a somewhat more complex conceptual model that still draws on sort of basic notions of political economy, but entails a broader set and conceptualization of stakeholders. And I identify specifically 4 of them, drawing them here as a series of circles that are partly nested inside each other, the big circle being simply all the stakeholders that a particular indicator actually entails. And then there are some who actually make the rules or draw up an indicator, create a particular measurement standards. Each standard, you can think of them as suppliers in the traditional sense for the most part. A second category is those who demand some kind of rule, measurement standard, etc. And I think that the better way to think about it is less in the sort of traditional consumption sense of economics and more in the political sense as people who are willing to pay some cost for actually having a particular measurement standard supplied. Those may be to some significant extent overlapping with those who actually draw up the measurement standard, but they need not necessarily be the same. And in fact, they need not be an overlap at all, and I'll come back to that in a second. A third subset of the stakeholders are those who are using standards either directly to measure a phenomenon or using the result of that measurement as an input in their decision making. And so some of the examples that we just heard about in the keynote refer to it not least critically in one of the questions, was the use of these rule of law measures by the World Bank, for instance, as a criterion for giving loans. Private organizations also use them with quite some regularity. Now, among those users, nested within them is a separate subgroup that I think conceptually is worthwhile again distinguishing, which I call the targets of an indicator, namely those whose behavior often is in fact the objective of doing this measurement, changing that behavior being the objective of the measurement, or at least those who are in a position who through a change in their behavior can change their ranking and rating as a consequence. This need not be a complete representation of all the stakeholders involved, which is why I leave some room on the sides, but I think those are sort of four key groups. Now, why is this important and how is it so conceptually helpful? Well, one of the ways in which it's helpful is that I think it helps us see much more clearly than a traditional supply and demand framework the kind of power relationships that are not necessarily even intentionally, but always in effect entailed in the creation and use of indicators. To the extent that rural suppliers and rural targets actually overlap, we come closest to the ideal of self-regulation, which normatively is relatively unproblematic. To the extent that they're completely separate, we see relationships of power that are potentially quite important and potentially quite problematic. In another time, let me just sort of illustrate this very briefly, which might help more than going into sort of a lot more abstract detail, by giving you a brief illustration that, at least for some of you, is probably close to your hearts, and on which there's an extensive literature which I simply draw upon, which is on law school rankings by the US News and World Report, which started in the 1980s. Initially, a relatively loose idea by a few members of the staff of the magazine, and at that point, demanders and suppliers were almost identical. The only difference being is that some law school deans were asked to give some input, and so there's a little bit of overlap with another stakeholder group that's not even clearly specified. And the users that the original editors were imagining were law students without a very clear sense at all how pervasively used those indicators would become later on. And there was really no target group in the sense that they certainly weren't consciously, by all indications, attempting to influence anybody's behavior. As many of you know, obviously these law school rankings and it have been enormously influential because you can influence where you end up in the rankings by making strategic hiring decisions, allocation of resources between the library and other things, etc. So that some 15 years later or so, you look at a situation where this has become a larger sphere with a lot more actors, with a clearly identified set of targets, namely the law schools themselves, but a much broader set of users, some of which you can think of also as demanders in the sense that they do desire to have these kind of rankings. Others, maybe university administrators, some of them would rather have them not exist. And a set of suppliers that is drawn relatively large to the circle in order to be achieving these overlaps, but which actually provide things which is actually still almost entirely consisting of the journal editors. We can apply that same kind of general framework also to indicators such as the World Bank's rule of law indicator that's a component of the governance indicators that we heard about in the keynote address, as well as to phenomena such as the World Justice Project's rule of law indicator, that was intended essentially to replace and take a step further that rule of law component of the World Bank component indicator. But the people who are actually drawing up that indicator are a very different set of folks, although not entirely unrelated to the World Bank staff who used to do this work previously. This all raises the question to what extent indicators sort of go inherently through a kind of life cycle, potentially of competition to the extent that there are real power relationships involved, and I'd be happy to discuss that further if so much later. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tim, for talking essentially about where indicators come from. I'm going to address two slightly different questions, which are, first of all, what do they measure? So what is being captured by some of the indicators that I think a lot of us are concerned about, these global indicators of the quality of governance and the quality of the rule of law. And then secondly, how useful are they for policymakers? And here I'm thinking primarily of domestic policymakers, so people in national governments, as opposed to, say, people in the World Bank or social scientists who are interested in testing theories. And I'll try to give a sense of why I think they're helpful as clues, and I don't want to suggest that they're not helpful, so before I get into the critique, let me make it clear I do think that these things are valuable to some extent, but they're of limited value, and so I'll try to explain why. So first of all, briefly on the question of what they capture. What do they measure? A legal system, to me, has at least three components that are worth distinguishing. First of all, you've got the laws, right? So let's think of the laws on the books. Secondly, you've got the way in which the laws are actually administered. So if it's an actual living legal system, an operating legal system, you've got the laws being applied by judges, by police officers, by administrative agencies, and so forth. And then second, finally, you've got the behavior that's actually induced by the operation of the legal system, the way the subjects of the law are behaving, taking into account the laws on the books and the actual way in which they're being administered. So if you think of different indicators, like the World Bank's doing business indicators, for instance, which I'll assume you have some sense of, right? So they've got this measure of the ease of enforcing contracts. And it actually captures the first two factors, right? The first two features of the legal system. Part of that is based on how many steps, how many procedures are involved in enforcing a contract in a hypothetical case. That's a measure of that's a function of the law on the books, right? You look at the Code of Civil Procedure in a particular jurisdiction, it will tell you what you have to do to enforce that contract. It also, though, the doing business indicators has a measure of the number of days or the time it takes to enforce the contract. That's a function not only of the procedural rules, but also the way in which the judges are behaving. And the lawyers, and actually the volume of cases and so forth. But it's got more. It's a function of more than just the law and books. It's at least capturing what the way the laws are being administered, the practices, right? So, so there's that. Now, as far as the outcomes are concerned, or the behavior, if we're looking at the enforcement of contracts, we'd be interested in something like the propensity of people to breach contracts in a particular scenario. We don't have that particular measure, but there are other outcome measures out there that are quite popular. And I think quite often the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index is viewed as being a measure of outcomes. It's viewed as being a measure of the prevalence of corruption, the propensity of people to either demand or pay bribes. For reasons I'll get into later, I don't think that's actually what it captures, but it's often understood that way. Right? So those, I think, are the three different things that indicators are often measuring, either the laws, the practices, or some sort of outcomes. Right? Okay, so that's my starting point. In the question now to the issue of how useful are these indicators. One more background point. What I said about focusing on their use by policymakers, national policymakers, that's very different from the use of indicators for, say, research purposes, for the purpose of testing theories, right, about the role of law and development. The difference is, I think, the theorist or the social scientist is interested in the general relationship between institutions and development. What happens in the typical country, or the average country, if you want to be fussier, well, if you want to fudge it a bit. Whereas the policymaker cares about what's happening in their particular country, right? What is the relationship between law and development outcomes in our case, in this particular case? It's sort of like the difference between a medical researcher, on the one hand, who's interested in, well, what causes high blood pressure in general? Oh, we know it's usually caused by being overweight and so forth. As opposed to the clinician who's interested in a particular patient and is asking, well, what's causing high blood pressure in this particular patient? It might be the fact that they're overweight, but it might also be the fact that they've got a rare congenital sensitivity to salt or something like that. And that difference matters, right, in terms of what you're going to prescribe. It also matters whether their high blood pressure is actually going to lead to further problems, or if they're one of those people for whom it's not a big deal. Right? So that's the situation I'm working with. So I'm assuming now that we're focused on, say, the policymakers in a place like Jamaica, to be concrete about it. And we're trying to figure out what should we make of these global indicators? What should we make of low scores on these global indicators? So let's think first of all about the indicators of laws and practices. I think we should care about a low score on those if the indicators are good measures, so if they're reliable and they're valid, and if they are connected somehow to outcomes that we care about, because we don't care about the indicators in themselves. Right? The low score on the indicators doesn't really matter in its own right. It's the outcomes that matter. Right? I'll assume that. We're not interested in the aesthetic qualities of the legal system. So the fact of the matter is a lot of the more popular indicators, at least the way they're reported, are not terribly useful in these terms. Right? Leaving aside the issues of reliability, on the validity front, they're often too highly aggregated to be very helpful. So doing business indicators of enforcing contracts, they often aggregate the measures of the number of procedures on the one hand, and the time it takes, and actually the cost, to come up with a single score for the ease of enforcing contracts. We don't know what that's measuring, right? So it's not a valid measure of any one of those phenomena because of the aggregation. It's also not necessarily connected to outcomes that we care about. The quality of the civil justice system is obviously often important. In general, it's going to be important. But the ease of enforcing contracts will also be a function of things like the ease of accessing arbitration, right, commercial arbitration, as a substitute for going to the courts, and the ease of settlement. Right? So if the courts are slow but very, very predictable and you've got a loser-pays system, it's not clear to me that, at least as a theoretical matter, that the time it would take to get to trial is actually going to be a determinative feature of the outcomes in terms of propensity to breach contracts. So that causal link between the features of the legal system on the one hand and outcomes that we care about may not be present or may not be the same in every country. Also, that outcome that's typically associated with a low score or poor set of legal institutions along this measure may not be one that we really care about in this country. So again, taking the Jamaican example as the case study, they don't do well on this indicator. Right? They're number 100 and something in terms of the ease of enforcing contracts. I'm not sure that's Jamaica's biggest problem, though. The number one problem, I think everyone would agree, is crime. Right? Maybe corruption, but number one, right up there, crime, and in particular, the most heinous of crimes, murder. Right? It's often vying with South Africa or Venezuela for being the country with the highest murder rate in the world. Delay in the civil courts, pretty far down there in the set of priorities. And the concern is that if you take that indicator, that low score on the ease of enforcing contracts indicator as a guide to making policy, you might do something like allocate resources from the criminal courts to the civil courts and actually limit your ability to combat what ought to be the number one priority. Right? So that's the sense in which the indicators may not be causally connected to outcomes that we really care about. Okay. Let me shift now to indicators that focus on outcomes as opposed to features of the legal system. I'll use the Corruption Perceptions Index as my principal example. I think everyone will agree that corruption is a problem. That seems to be the conventional wisdom now. There used to be debate about that, more debate about that, but let's assume that that's the case. How useful is something like the Corruption Perceptions Index as a measure of corruption, right? And whether we're making progress in combating corruption? Well, again, I think it depends on whether we think it's a valid and reliable measure of the prevalence of corruption. And in this particular case, that's highly questionable. The first thing to know about this indicator is that it really does not just look at the propensity to pay bribes. It's the way it's constructed. It aggregates the results of several surveys. I think up to 7 or maybe 9 different surveys, depending on the country, that generally have something to do with corruption. Right? They're sort of in the ballpark of a corruption questionnaire. So some of the surveys will ask things like, are there laws in the books that hold politicians accountable? Right? Other surveys will ask, well, are corrupt officials prosecuted and penalized? Right? Others will ask, well, how common is it to pay bribes, or how common is it for officials to receive bribes or demand bribes? So they really are lumping together all 3 of those dimensions of the legal system that I was referring to earlier. Some of them are measuring the laws, some are measuring the practices, and some of them are actually measuring outcomes. And we don't know what we're getting in the end. Right? It's like putting them all into a blender, and at the end of the day, who knows what you've got. So that's one concern about what it is. But if we assume that it's somehow correlated with the prevalence of corruption, let's pretend that I didn't just say that, and that this is really a measure of the prevalence of corruption. I still think we have to worry about the reliability. Because obviously, corruption is difficult to observe, and there's going to be a high, it's going to be a large error term in this particular measure. That's inevitable. But the errors are going to be of a funny kind, right? For one thing, what do you think people are going to do when they realize, well, we don't know exactly how much corruption is going on in the country? They might base their responses to the survey question on, well, the scores on the last survey. Right? So the scores are going to be persistent over time. Or they might say, well, we assume that there's a lot of corruption if the authorities seem to be making a lot of effort to combat corruption. And then you could have the perverse outcome where people are making more effort to combat corruption. The institutions are more effective in a sense, but you'll do worse on the index. So those are the kinds of vulnerabilities that measure will have. So those are just some sort of snippets of the reasons why I think we have to be concerned about the value of some of these indicators as guides to policymaking. I think they're certainly useful as indicators of where there might be problems. There are suggestions that further inquiry is warranted in many circumstances. But ideally what you do is start with the problem, start with the outcomes we care about, and then work back and try to find the features of the legal system that are problematic. And those may not be the types of the features of legal systems that typically cause the problems, right? That are typically captured by these global indicators. Okay, I think I've used up my maybe 15 minutes even, so I'll stop there, but look forward to the questions.
So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I wanted to thank Katie Robinette, Paul Cox, and Valentina Restrepo not only for putting together a wonderful conference, but also for doing so by asking so little of their faculty advisors. So today I'll focus on a question that's puzzled me for quite some time, which is, why are indicators powerful? 2 answers come to mind really quickly. One is legal obligation, the other is money. Sometimes it's the case that indicators are placed in documents that are otherwise legally binding. Sometimes it's the case that IMF grants or loans, money from the World Bank and other donors is attached to performance at a certain level measured by a particular indicator. But often that's not the case. Often international organizations, non-governmental bodies just put out a list of numbers, and those numbers take on a life of their own. So what I want to ask today is what it is. Why is information so powerful? I have a simple thesis, and that thesis is that indicators are very valuable to ordinary citizens who are seeking to evaluate their government and trying to sort out a government that's performing very, very poorly because of its own mistakes and own bad policies from a government that's doing the best it can in the face of regional economic crisis or global economic crisis. So I'll just start with a story about how politicians use indicators strategically to try to persuade skeptical voters that their ideas are not radical experiments, but instead are going to bring about good results. So in order to figure out why we have indicators, why they're so prevalent, it's sometimes helpful to go to an era before we had real indicators, when we had perhaps what I'll call proto-indicators. I'll take us back to the 1960s when the World Health Organization did something very simple. It listed a bunch of countries, and next to every country name, it put a number, and that was what percentage of GDP was allocated to healthcare expenditure. So this, if there ever was a crude indicator that synthesizes a lot of information that does not accurately speak to the quality of healthcare provision or enjoyment by individual payments, this pure money number certainly was that. So I was intrigued in my fieldwork to figure out where these rankings were appearing in domestic debates, and to find these very same numbers repeated in election campaign documents and in legislative debates. To take one example, when the Socialist Party was trying to take over the government of Greece and trying to win elections, one of the key platforms they ran on was a reform of the national health system. They wanted to introduce a radical expansion in coverage and other reforms. And in order to persuade people who were skeptical about this, that this was not a utopian solution, they highlighted this WHO number and they said, look, we're spending 3% of our GDP on healthcare, and this puts us in the category of developing countries. To be developed, you have to cross the 5% threshold, and we want us to take Greece there, and moreover, we want to get all the way to 8, because 8% is the European average, and one day we want to be not just developed, but European. What was really interesting to me was that when moving from one side, from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Western Mediterranean, exactly the same conversation was happening in the early 1980s in Spain. So the Spanish socialists were making exactly the same argument. They were saying, look, we spend 4% of our GDP on healthcare. This puts us in the category of developing countries. We want to be a developed country, and that means that we have to cross this 5% threshold, which is this arbitrary average that the WHO came up with. Even more striking was not what the socialists were saying, but what the conservatives made of this data. They disagreed with the socialists on everything, including healthcare policy. Any issue of redistribution is, of course, likely to play sharply on these left-right cleavages, but they said, we totally agree with you. We're at 4%. That puts us in the developing country group. We need to get to 5%, and moreover, let's aim for 8, which is what Europe is doing, but we should get there in a different way. Let's not rely as much on central spending from the central government, but perhaps put in more power from the regions and the private sector. So to me, what was shocking is how much consensus a single number, a very crude number, could create among people of very different ideologies in very different countries. So to me, this tells me something simple about indicators, namely how they can be used in the political process to increase accountability of governments, to allow people with radical ideas to show that this is not a utopia that they're promised, but it has been tried before, and to suggest that they should come to power democratically to introduce what others have done before them. This illustration also helps suggest in what context indicators will be more or less powerful. So there's a couple of things about Greece and Spain that distinguish these countries from other countries, for example, from the US. Greece and Spain both have low capacity to produce information domestically. This was especially true in the 1980s relative to today. And moreover, information that is produced is not considered to be nonpartisan. So there's no, there are universities and there are nonpartisan bodies, but they're not at the ranking of American universities. So local information production capacity is more limited. Moreover, the other feature of these countries is that while they're relatively rich, they're not at the top of any kind of hierarchy the way the US sometimes perceives itself to be. They had other rich Western European neighbors very close by, and these comparisons were facilitated by the fact that culturally proximate and geographically proximate countries were available and allowed for these kinds of comparisons and shared aspirations. So where does this leave me on the question of whether indicators are normatively desirable? I agree absolutely with what Kevin said, that they can only be a second best solution. They aggregate far too much information, and even if we could capture all the desirable information in a single number that is valid across countries, it can't possibly be that the same solution is appropriate for so many countries. It can't possibly be correct that we want to stop experimentation. However, at the end of the day, I'm more optimistic and call this a second best solution because I'm really worried about a world without indicators, about what government accountability would look like in those cases. I think that in a world of many governments that are not democratic, but even in the world where many governments are democratic, it's very difficult for citizens to find information and decide whether or not a crisis is a problem triggered by their own government's bad policies, or whether their government is doing absolutely superbly relative to other countries in the world. And indicators help citizens with that task.
Great, well, thank you, and thank you to the panelists for getting us started. You know, in my own work doing in human rights, indicators are used or arguably misused in all kinds of arguments. So I just wanted to, in particular, this question for human rights indicators, and I think it hits on all of the topics there. How much do they lead? How much do they follow? How those have evolved over time? What we think about indicators, what we think that they're actually telling us about the world, and whether or not these relationships between, for example, how well a country is being evaluated on something called a human rights index, may not really get at some of the things that we care about. It may get at part of the things we care about, right? If you see that summary executions have gone down with a new democratic government, the government says, well, that's a good thing, but it doesn't necessarily tell you much about the independence of the judiciary, right? Because that's not what it's designed to measure. So the complexity of indicators and an over-reliance on them, I think, is very much a word of caution. How they're supposed to be evaluated, what they can really tell us about the world and the things that we want to understand, I think are all wonderful cautionary tales that the panelists have teed up. So would like to invite questions from the audience to the panelists, and I guess I just want to say that for those of you who don't have a background in economics or statistics, feel free to relate the themes of the panelists to your own work and interests, because I do think that whether or not we're doing quantitative work or more normative and qualitative work, we're intersecting with facts and figures and how those are used and how meaningful they are. So I know the panelists will be generous with their time and understanding for the non-technicians in the audience. So with that, any questions?
Thank you. My name is Remy. I'm a student here. I wondered, one of the themes that came up earlier in the keynote and in your presentations was that the users and the targets of the indicators aren't necessarily the same people that are producing them. And so I wondered if you could speak to ways that the interests of the target community could be better taken into account in the design of the indicators. I know one of the movements, for example, is to try to take into account the views of the communities that are that we try to help through the indicators. Do you have success stories of indicators that were developed in a participative manner? What can we do about that?
We're going to take a few questions, and then you guys, why don't we take a few, sort of a question, and then about users and targets and how targets could be more integrated. Let's take a couple questions, and then the panelists can answer those as well as respond.
So
My name is Ariel. I'm also a student here, and I have a question.
Doing it is complicated because you need to then again actually find some ways of measuring in valid, comparable ways the experience that people actually make with governance, the administration of justice, or whatever you're actually concerned about. That said, I would certainly largely agree with Katharina that simply wanting to sort of do away with indicators would most likely in most cases be a step backwards, and that's not, I think, what too many at least are advocating. I think the sort of interesting life cycle that happens often is that in the early stages of an indicator, when it's first being developed and is the first few times put out, there's a relatively extensive discussion about proper ways of measuring, what are the appropriate stakeholder groups that need to be taken into account, etc. How is the different national and local context being taken into account? That kind of debate and the contextual information that often is part of the initial publications tends to fall away. So even within the first few years now that we have the World Justice Project's indicator, the publications are getting thinner, they have more sort of empty space, they start to look more like a corporate report with a two-page summary, and less and less contextual information, nice glossy graphs, but thereby sort of extracting ever further away from a lot of that kind of contextual information that Kevin gave us some great illustrations of being so important.
Let me address the first two questions together, I guess. So if we stay within the world of indicators, one way to provide for more local input into what really matters is just ask a more open-ended question, right? So if you just say, do you have a problem with corruption in your country? People can then focus on whichever kind of corruption they think is most pressing and sort of automatically decide for themselves what matters, and it sort of corrects itself in a very unpredictable way. So I'll just throw that out there as one way of responding to the concern about the users not being involved in setting the priorities as to what's being measured. But that's not what I really wanted to focus on, because I do think it's important to not just be a critic, but also think about perhaps ways of improving indicators or alternatives to indicators, and what would this world without indicators actually look like. And I'm actually not convinced that it would necessarily be a bad world. Because if I think about indicators, I think about simplifications, right, of data. Simple data that try to provide simplified representations of more complex social phenomena. What's the alternative to that? Well, one alternative is not to measure the phenomena at all, but the other is to engage in less simplification, to work with more raw data, right? Or big data, to use the current phrase. And I think that also has possibilities. So for example, with this enforcing contracts indicator, instead of asking a handful of lawyers in a country, how long do you think it would take for this hypothetical case to be resolved, and how many procedures would, how many steps would be involved, how much would it cost, and so forth. In principle, you could actually collect the data on the real cases, the actual cases that went through that justice system, cases of all sorts, not just the cases that fit the hypothetical facts, and then people could make of it what they like, right? So if you had not just the raw data, but then provided free and open access to it, and allowed intermediaries, including all sorts of civil society organizations, to produce their own indicators, their own reports, their own narratives, that, I think, is an alternative to more indicators, right? More of these simplified representations. And I think moving in that direction could be useful and does provide more scope for people to decide which information is important to them, more scope for citizens to hold governments accountable in the ways that they think matter. In terms of examples of this kind of behavior, I guess the social audits that have been lobbied for in parts of India might be an example where they just look for, but it's just really a demand for more transparency in government to oversimplify. I think it's right to say that the level of local capacity matters. This is still costly, the exercise of collecting the data, putting it in machine-readable form, posting it on the internet, and then the capacity to organize it and analyze it. You know, these intermediaries would also require resources. But if the international community is serious about enhancing the quality of the information that's available for decision making, I think this is an alternative direction in which to go instead of more indicators, more data. So that's my pitch. And that's my vision of the world without indicators. As far as specific research on the impact of prosecutions on scores on corruption indicators, I don't know of anything. So this is a hypothesis. There certainly might be studies out there, but I don't know of anything.
So I'll first speak to Laurel's question about the problems with human rights indicators in particular, and then to Ariel's questions on local capacity building and what a world without indicators might mean, a world where there's a lot of misinformation produced locally. So there's two particular problems that the literature on human rights indicators, I think, has identified and that have led to studies like On a Hathaway's to be heavily criticized by studies that show, for example, that there's no correlation or negative correlation between the legalization of a regime and treaty outcomes. And those two problems are as follows. One is trending. So it's the very success of the human rights movement means that over time, in every country, on average, we've had better and better human rights performance. And that's not adequately captured in the data. The data does not, we don't have a fixed baseline against which to compare the report from the 1990s and the report of the 1950s. Our expectations for human rights are increasing as we see this kind of progress, so the data are not comparable over time, and when you have something that's trending upwards, you can correlate it with pretty much anything and find a relationship there. That's one big problem. The second has to do with reporting. When you see a number that a country is reporting that more people were tortured, you're not sure whether to see it as a huge failure that more people are being tortured, or as a fact that a government that previously did not disclose how many people were tortured, it has now reduced the number of people that were tortured, but is providing a more accurate reporting. So these two problems are huge, but I don't think they're a problem with indicators. So they're not a problem with the aggregation and the simplification. If you read all of the amnesty reports one by one, you would still have these same problems, and they're absolutely problems that have to be addressed and that severely impede quantitative research in this area. Now, can indicators help in the human rights world, given that they have these two very fundamental problems? I think they can. I think an excuse that governments often use so as not to promote human rights, especially social and economic rights, is we can't afford it. So we can't give you access to clean water, clean sewage, and so on because we're just poor and have other development goals, and indicators can help highlight which governments actually cannot afford this and which governments are using their resources in other ways that are not advancing human rights. I think one big success story in the European area with an indicator that switched definitions and brought a lot of governments to pay attention had to do with the area of unemployment. So in Europe, the number one problem a lot of people will agree is unemployment, the fact that people do not have jobs. So the governments used to all report unemployment numbers, and the governments could not agree to coordinate unemployment policy because this is hugely costly and implicates key debates. But one thing they could agree on was an indicator, and they redefined the indicator, the number that Eurostat would publicize, from the unemployment figure to the employment figure. And this seems like a really trivial change, but it had very large policy implications because the unemployment is defined as people who are looking for work. Employment is defined as people who have work, and there's this residual category of people who are discouraged from looking for work. And one number allows governments to hide what they're doing with that number, and the other number does not. And this simple change, where Eurostat just collected all this data of actually how many people were employed made some big difference. So I'm quite optimistic even in areas of human rights and labor rights where the indicators are problematic. Could we imagine a world where we did not need indicators? Absolutely, I agree that nuanced information would be better than, or both nuanced information and open access to information is absolutely desirable. Is the aggregation helpful as well as the raw data? And should we allow a lot of people to aggregate? That's the only point on which we might disagree. And I think there's something to the aggregation that's really, really helpful. There's something disorienting to an ordinary citizen to say, look, open this database and figure out what's happening. And there's something in that simple number that you can really use to persuade and speak to people who have very limited informational capacities, very little interest in doing this research on their own. And I think another world where indicators or comparative indicators might not be useful is a world with excellent domestic information production. So here in the US, when politicians lie, we know about it. We often hear about it. We have a press that's relatively nonpartisan. We have the Congressional Budget Office that, relative to other countries where it's really a mouthpiece of particular parties, the Congressional Budget Office, which will assess particular proposals and tell people, what the cost of certain ideas are. We have a federal system in which we can often look to the states for experiences with success and failure. We have world-class universities. And if other countries had these capabilities, I believe the need and the value for indicators would be much more limited.
Should we go to another round then of, for a second round of questions? Yeah, Holly and then.
Thanks so much for your comments. I noticed the discussion is focusing a lot on domestic policies and rule of law in a domestic sense, or country by country. But a big part of the debate right now is how do we also talk about rule of law on a global level, that including international criminal law, the respect for rule of law that international corporations have, international civil suits. And I just wondered if there's anything to say about indicators on that international level, if it would be helpful, what that would look like, and how it may or may not affect domestic rule of law indicators.
So my name is Art Cray. I know I'll have the floor later, but I wanted to react to a few of the things that some members on the panel have said, because they're near to my own experience as a producer of the Worldwide Governance Indicators, which are a widely used cross-country database measuring various dimensions of governance. So you'll forgive, it's not entirely obvious where the question is going to be and what I'm going to say, but you can interpret it with a question mark at the end. So the first thing is that various panelists have said disparaging things about aggregation. Aggregation in this business is often viewed as a four-letter word, and I feel the need to remind people that actually aggregation has 11 letters in it and not 4. And in fact, there are 11 letters that come together to actually something quite useful, right? So there's nothing intrinsically bad with aggregation, particularly when you make the disaggregated data available. So Kevin, you gave the example of when my colleagues at the World Bank Group doing business indicators combined together the number of days, the number of procedures, and the cost to enforce a contract, and that was sort of a horrible use of aggregation. Well, yeah, but I mean, they also report the 3 variables individually. They're right beside the aggregate one, so it's not rocket science to figure out how to disaggregate it as well, because it's reported right there. In fact, I would go even a step further, because you were sort of sketching a vision whereby the world would be a great place if lots of organizations provided lots of detailed data, and then people could go and aggregate it in the way that they wish, that's most suitable for their own purposes, and so on. So that sounds great in practice. Now, I want to give you a concrete example. So with the Worldwide Governance Indicators, we assemble a couple of hundred variables each year that feed into these sort of 6 composite measures of governance that we construct. Since the early 2000s, we've been making all the disaggregated indicators available together with the aggregate ones. Since I learned how to start counting, which is relatively recently, since 2007, counting hits, we've had 1.2 million visits to the website for people who come and download the data. I'm aware of exactly one case where somebody has gone and proposed a different aggregation of disaggregated indicators. So 1 out of 1.2 million. Somehow it seems that there's a barrier to people doing that. It could be, ignorance, it's overwhelming, as Katerina suggests. It could be people are just lazy and they choose not to do so. So I think that's an important perspective on this sort of view of aggregation. One sort of narrow thing, I think the person asked the question left, so they missed the answer. So what do we know about whether these perceptions indicators sort of mean revert because people are looking at sort of what happened in the past and using that? So there is actually research on it, some of which I've done, so I can tell you about that. So one of the predictions that you would expect, if it's the case that sort of the people who are answering these questions that go into indicators are either looking at each other or looking at what happened in the past, you have this prediction that indicators should converge a lot over time. They should become much more strongly correlated with each other over time. So you can actually bring a question like that to the data, which we've done in the context of some of the indicators that feed into the worldwide governance indicators. You actually find no evidence at all of that kind of convergence going on. So I think it's an interesting speculation, but I think it's a speculation that requires support. And then one last thing I want to raise that hasn't been raised yet, but that I think is really important in this field of indicators is the importance of free entry. Okay, so there's free entry in the market for indicators, and I think the question we need to ask ourselves is why that isn't exercised more often. So I think one of the best examples of useful free entry in the market for indicators comes from inflation in Argentina. So starting around mid-2007, the Kirchners started fiddling with the statistical agency in Argentina and telling them to cook the inflation statistics. So this was sort of well known in Argentina discussions that the inflation figures were being cooked. But nobody really knew how much they were being cooked until an enterprising junior faculty at MIT Sloan, Alberto Cavallo, wrote some software that went and trolled the internet and scraped price data from online price information for Argentina, constructed an alternative inflation index, which in every other country in Latin America tracks official inflation perfectly, and in Argentina, it runs 10 percentage points per year below official inflation. So this is an example of free entry making a difference. And I think some of the honestly, griping that goes on around governance indicators, I think would be served by a little more free entry.
Right. So let's have a round of responses.
Sure. Well, let me just respond to some of the last points. I think it's precisely because there are effectively considerable barriers, not because they're formally placed there necessarily, although for many things it's also clear. Freedom House has been for a long time criticized for not making a shred of information about the components that enter into their democracy indices available to anybody outside of the...
And same with Transparency International with their CPI. I think it's a valid...
But I think it is in fact important to recognize that even when the disaggregated information is in principle available, there are barriers to entry effectively because it actually takes an enormous amount of effort to certainly do something that's likely to get attention and be recognized as better as something on which a substantial amount of World Bank staff has spent a good bit of time, I suspect. That's precisely why they derive some of their power from. Now, there's, I think, quite a bit of debate about sort of particular components, and often that essentially gets ignored. So, one of the doing business indicators, one of the components of that, right, is the amount of time it takes to register a company. And the design of the indicator is such that the less time it takes, the better it is for business. Now, on some level, that's obviously true. If it takes you several months to register a company, then that creates a very significant barrier to economic exchange and well-functioning markets and all that. It's a real barrier to entry. But it's not at all clear why having actually a company registered within a day is necessarily better than within a week. That is well known. That point has been made. It's not something I originally came up with, but it gets ignored as far as I can tell in the construction of these kinds of measures. Just a word on the international rule of law. As far as I know, there's very little of even attempts made to get at that question. So I suppose if we're looking for a subject matter to work on, it would be a very promising one, and there certainly is plenty to look at there. Yeah, one of the issues that I've worked a bit on in past years is bilateral investment treaties that create a private enforcement regime via arbitration that is quite unique in international law. And the extent to which you can achieve very substantial awards against governments from these arbitration panels, it is highly variable. Measuring that in some systematic way, differentiating between the different institutional settings in which these kinds of arbitration procedures take place, for instance, would probably get at some significant element of, at least in the sort of international business law part of international rule of law.
So there's always a danger that what I say is taken as a critique of the producers as opposed to the users. Or the uses. And actually, remember, my focus was on the users and whether they should take your data and use it as a guide for policy-making purposes. And so the fact that you and your colleagues in the Doing Business project provide access to the disaggregated data is, of course, extremely laudable and very, very helpful. And so my comment is that people should take more advantage of that and that there should be more hits. And it's worth asking what the barriers to entry actually are. And so for the bank side, from the bank side, the only implication, I think, really is, should you be trying to address some of those potential barriers? So subsidizing local universities in their efforts to take the disaggregated data and construct indices that would be useful for local purposes. So that's the kind of implication. It's not that you should stop aggregating and stop trying to aggregate in the way that you think is best on average. That's clearly useful, I think. On the question of indicators of the quality of the global rule of law, this is actually an issue that I'm quite interested in these days because I've been focusing a lot of my research on anti-corruption law and the role of foreign actors in combating corruption in developing countries. So tomorrow I'm actually here again presenting a paper on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and how it's been enforced across various countries, or in relation to various countries. The challenge I see in coming up with indicators of the quality of that kind of transnational law enforcement is deciding the standards to be applied to them. To the standards that ought to be applied to the institution, because it's now you can't say, well, it's the standards should be developed locally, right? The targets should be the people who set the standards. Now multiple countries are involved. So, for instance, if I'm measuring the quality of the FCPA as a tool for, or as an institutional structure for combating transnational corruption, should I be looking at the interests of the developing countries, the host countries where the bribes are paid? Is that the right set of standards? Should I be focusing on whether enforcement is being targeted at countries that are most afflicted by corruption or that have the weakest institutions? Or should I be using standards that look at how well it's aligned with the interests of the U.S. population, right, with U.S. economic interests? So is it being applied fairly across, say, U.S. companies and companies that are based in other countries, right? And I think those are equally legitimate standards, but an indicator that focuses on one as opposed to the other might generate quite different scores. So I think that's the general problem that arises when you try to come up with indicators of the quality of these transnational institutions. There's going to be less, there's a potential for less consensus about the appropriate standards that should be embodied in the indicators.
So I agree with pretty much everything that was said so far, so I just want to ask a provocative question to Kevin, I guess. And that is, I think one of the reasons why we have different intuitions is because we're talking about different indicators. So I'm looking at a number of areas where the outcomes are human rights, economic development, social development, and so on. And if anything, in those areas, I think there are too few indicators. And I think indicators would be good and allow for more comparisons. I'd want more comparisons on access to food, access to drugs. Would you want to see, is your criticism of indicators in part because of the very particular issue areas in which the indicators have been used? Is it because of the doing business indicators that you're focused on? Would you want to see, for example, more development of the Millennium Development Goals and other indicators of these types of social and economic justice?
Yeah, I think a lot depends on the distinction between these indicators that measure outcomes and indicators that measure the rules and practices. I am much more comfortable with the indicators of outcomes. I think there should be more of them. Generally, the issues there are just reliability and the fact that in practice, it's going to be difficult to use them to trace back to the causal, to the institutions that will influence them, right? So generally, I have, my sense is the more the better with indicators of outcomes, as long as they're truly indicators of outcomes as opposed to some sort of mishmash. I tend to be much more critical of indicators that purport to measure the rules and the practices. I think in part of this is the professional jealousy. As a lawyer, I'm concerned that people just don't get it, that the economists just don't get it when they're trying to measure law. So maybe that's a personal factor that's influencing things. But certainly, it's a variegated critique. Yeah.
So I would just like to ask the panelists, so what, if you could pick either your favorite indicator or the worst indicator out there and how horribly misused it is, if you could comment on either one, so your most favorite, least favorite, and why. Because I think that a lot of this can be helped to make it concrete, because it seems that there are so, the utility of an indicator is so much related to the context, both in which it's developed and the purpose for which it's being used. So I would just be interested to hear comments on that.
Well, let me slightly elaborate on one that I already mentioned, namely Freedom House democracy indicator, which has two parts, civil rights and political rights. And there's separate 7-point measures provided for that, and then they aggregate them into a single democracy score, which runs from 1 to 3 with half steps in between. Now, that has quite wide coverage. It was one of the earliest to be, well, it was the earliest to be provided. Later on, a couple other measures ended up going further back by reconstructing situations in earlier times. But both because of the prominence that it's achieved in the media, and because it was the first entrant, I suppose, it is very widely used. The measures rely, the numerical scores reported rely upon expert input that Freedom House collects from unidentified sources in each country. They certainly don't just do that. They provide some justification for it, and that they want to make sure, particularly in non-democratic context, to protect their sources, etc., all of which is on some level understandable, but the effect is that it's basically impossible to trace what actually goes into these measures. They have a strange correlation, particularly in some sudden changes with the preferences of the US government vis-a-vis various countries around the world. And they essentially make it and they also are being invoked with a tremendous regularity for the importance of political factors that are then not further specified, because you can't, because you don't know what's going into it, because they correlate very nicely with all kinds of things, where very likely things like economic outcome, how well a country is doing in terms of economic growth, etc., actually enter into these completely subjective measures that are being created in the first place. And so you get sort of causal circularity with the kinds of things that you might want to be explaining with civil or political rights that is impossible to trace.
Do you have any favorites?
Still thinking. Go ahead.
So I'll pick the Millennium Development Goals. What I like about this indicator, one is that it's simple, so 10 steps, not a huge report, and I think simplicity is very important for a number of audiences. Second, that the 10 steps are not all the obvious steps. So there are a number of indicators that were a little surprising to me, such as those involving gender, which have been shown to correlate with a lot of good outcomes and would not have received this kind of prominence were they not one of 10 simple indicators. And third, because the Millennium Development Goals set very concrete targets. You need to get to a certain level by a certain date. You're not on the path to development for decades, and you can move at the pace you grow. And the reason I like these indicators and I think they're effective is because just as national governments can lose accountability and can keep on doing whatever they're doing without a lot of checks, so international organizations are huge bureaucracies and can also lose track of whether their particular contribution is moving towards the organization's overall mission. And I think for the UN in particular, the Millennium Development Goals have caused a real reassessment of what the priorities are and how particular parts of this very large organization are contributing towards reaching development goals in a timely fashion.
I just have trouble answering the question the way you posed it, because I think the value really does depend on the use. So for instance, I would say often the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index would be up there among my least favorite indicators. But in this paper that I'm presenting tomorrow, we use something pretty close to it. I think it's better. I think it's actually control of corruption indicator. So the World Bank's control of corruption indicator is one of the control variables in our regression. So I think if you're looking for a measure of perceptions of corruption that, measures of perception on the part of U.S. policymakers of the levels of corruption across the world, that's a very good measure, right? So I think that's a perfectly coherent set of views, that I think those indicators are not so useful for national policymakers, but for some other, in the country, but maybe for, say, prosecutors trying to decide how to allocate enforcement resources, they might be helpful. And I really also have to say that my favorite data set is the doing business data set. The disaggregated data is just full of fascinating stuff, right? So I was doing this version of this talk in Jamaica, and I told them, well, look, if you take apart the ease of enforcing contracts indicator and look at what's driving the score below Barbados's, it takes 3 times as long to enforce the contract in Barbados, but the Jamaican lawyers are twice as expensive, and that's the problem. Oh, we didn't know that. It's useful when you look at the disaggregated data and use that as a basis for further inquiry. So I certainly think there's a lot of value in there. But what's reported in the newspaper is, the score has moved from 106 to 105 or 96 to 93, and I think that's pretty useless.
All right. Well, let's end where we began with a moment of silence for the U.S. World News and Report rankings, and hope that that before too long there will be better indicators, or that we will make better use of that data as targets and consumers and generators, and that we can all benefit from that at some future date. So please join me in thanking the panel.